Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 19 for History 102. And we were talking about the Red Scare. We're now in the 1920s. So and we're into chapter 30 in your textbook. So what we want to cover next are a couple of people that end up becoming victims or casualties, I suppose, of the Red Scare. And that's Nicola Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti. Now, these two gentlemen were Italian immigrants who lived outside of Boston in South Braintree, Massachusetts. Sacco was a shoe factory worker, and Vanzetti was a fish peddler. Back in this day and age, people used to have carts that they'd push through neighborhoods and sell fresh fish door to door right out of the Boston harbor. So these two Italian immigrants were, quite the characters, really. They were anarchists. They, believed in revolution and so forth. Both of them were self-professed atheists, and both of them bragged about the fact that during World War I, they dodged the draft. Now, so with some people, they weren't the most popular, but other people didn't, had no problem with them. But what's going to happen to turn their lives around is there's going to be a payroll robbery, murder, at the shoe factory where Sacco is employed. Now, let me explain to you how different it is back then. Back then on payday, you didn't get a paycheck. You'd line up at the factory, and they'd have, a tally sheet of how many hours you put in that particular week, and then they'd count out what they owed you, and they'd pay you in cash. So because of that, every week, large sums of cash would be brought in to factories all across America and paid for payday. And obviously, criminals figured this out, and they started targeting factories when they knew there'd be these boxes full of cash there to distribute to their employees. So, there's a robbery of that shoe factory, and in the process of the robbery, one of the employees is murdered. So, the police investigate this, and based on very shaky circumstantial evidence, Sacco and Vanzetti are arrested. And today, most people believe it's because of their unpopular views they were targeted. Police had run-ins with them, didn't like them. People are pointing fingers at them. So they're put on trial. And the trial is a complete circus. The judge in this trial was paranoid of communists, similar to Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. And anytime evidence was entering the courtroom on behalf of the defendants, Sacco and Vanzetti, he would spin his chair around and have his back facing the courtroom like he wasn't paying attention. Then, every time he referred to Sacco and Vanzetti in the courtroom, instead of calling them the defendants, he referred to them routinely as, quote, those anarchist bastards. So you can see what kind of fair trial they received. They're found guilty, and the judge sentences them to death. Now, there becomes a worldwide outcry over this trial. In fact, the Italian government begs the United States to deport the two to Italy, and they'll just keep them in a jail, but they won't execute them. But Massachusetts and the United States refuses. They exhaust all their appeals. And in 1927, both Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in the electric chair. So here's some outright casualties of the Red Scare. So the next thing we want to talk about, if that isn't crazy enough, we want to talk about the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan had faded away after the Force Acts and then obviously the Compromise of 1877, which handed the South back to white Southern control, so there's really no need for them. But obviously we've talked about how race relations were pretty horrible in the beginning of the 20th century during what's known as the Nadir. And the Ku Klux Klan is going to reorganize, and it's going to have its rebirth on Thanksgiving night in 1915 in the shadow of the huge carving or relief on the side of the mountain at Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is outside of Atlanta. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but there's really impressive carving on the side of this mountain that a lot of people refer to as the South Mount Rushmore. It has Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson on horseback, as well as the former president of the Confederacy, all carved in a giant relief on the side of the mountain. So Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson are on this. So in the shadow of that, a gentleman by the name of Colonel William J. Simons and about 30-some followers have a ceremony where the Klan has its rebirth. Now, the Klan, this modern Klan in the early 20th century, is going to be very different from the one of the Reconstruction period. For one thing, they're going to expand their scope of hatred. They're not only going to just hate African Americans, but they are anti-immigrant, they're anti-Catholic, they're anti-Jew, they're anti-pacifists, if you were against the war, they're anti-evolutionists. They don't believe in Darwin's theory. They're anti-birth control. They're about anti-everything, which really makes you wonder, who the heck can be a member? Well, to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan, you have to be what is described by an old term. I'm not even sure if they still use this term. The term WASP. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. If you fell into that category, you're in if you want to be. So, they become very popular within the next 10 years, and by 1924, they have 5 million dues-paying members. And they've expanded their operations to where not only are they a group of racist, angry men, they're trying to become legitimate and mainstream. They have a women's auxiliary order. And if you take a look on page 714 in your book, there's women Klan members marching right down Pennsylvania Avenue between the Capitol and the White House, right in our nation's capital, believe it or not. They have a junior order for boys that they model after the Boy Scouts. And they have the Triple K Club for girls, for little girls modeled after the Girl Scouts and Campfire Girls. Now, they're going to become so legitimate that in the election of 1924, they're going to win the control of 4 state legislatures. They're going to win a majority in Texas and Oklahoma, which might not surprise many. They're going to win a majority in Indiana, which might surprise some of you, but if you know anything about southern Indiana, it's still a hotbed of racism. But the one state that really is surprising that they won a majority in their state legislature is the state of Oregon. I don't know if you guys know much about Oregon. I have many relatives that live there, and I've been there several times. It's sort of like the Vermont of the West. And I really can't imagine the Ku Klux Klan controlling the governments in either of those places today. But times change. So what's ultimately going to be their downfall is, as usual, they can't help themselves and they turn violent. And they start burning Catholic churches and Jewish synagogues. And in the process, unfortunately, some rabbis die in these fires, and so do some Catholic priests. And that's when the federal government has to step in and start investigating these attacks, and they figure out it's the Klan. Then when they look further into Klan action, they figure out that Simons and the group that's in control are a bunch of embezzlers, and that they've stolen all the Klan's money because, as you remember, by 1924, they had 5 million dues-paying members. Well, Simon and the gang stole all the money. And once that becomes common knowledge, the Klan fades away as quickly as it rose back to popularity. And the Klan, unfortunately, in American society is kind of like the bad penny. It keeps appearing. And it'll rear its ugly head again in the 1950s in response to the civil rights movement. And it just keeps coming back from time to time as racism rears its ugly head in our country. A real unfortunate chapter of American history. So, the next thing we want to talk about, as far as, staying on the subject of wackiness in the 1920s, is we want to talk about another famous trial that took place in the 1920s. In fact, in 1925, and that's the trial of high school biology teacher John T. Scopes. This is commonly known as the monkey trial. So let me explain to you what happens in the Scopes quote-unquote monkey trial that takes place in Dayton, Tennessee. The state of Tennessee passed a law making it illegal to teach evolution in a high school biology class. High school biology teacher John T. Scopes defies this law and goes ahead and teaches evolution anyway. And his, rationale is, how in the world can I do my job as a biology teacher if I don't expose my students to the theory of evolution? I'd be doing a disservice to these children. So, because he violated that Tennessee state law, he's arrested and he's put on trial. And this trial is going to become headline news across America. Not so much that John Scopes put on trial, but the whole concept of evolution versus creationism is put on trial. Now, Scopes, who's just, a low-paid teacher in the 20s, obviously didn't have the money for any sort of good legal representation, but he didn't have to worry about that. The most prominent defense attorney of this era will defend him free of charge, or pro bono as it's known. That's the famous Clarence Darrow. So Darrow is Scopes' attorney. The trial takes place. If you take a look in your book on 719, you have a photo where they're showing the opposition to Scopes, the Anti-Evolution League, where they're selling books there, and they talk about the conflict, hell in the high school. So this trial is quite a circus, with the press all coming into the sleepy little town of Dayton, Tennessee. The prosecution's star witness is our old pal, the 3-time loser and the former Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. He's retired now from public life. He's a big supporter of creationism and religious groups, and he's going to be sort of, I guess, the expert witness at this trial. When he's on the stand, they'll ask him questions, and he'll basically testify that he believes every single thing that's in the Bible literally. That, yes, there's an Adam and Eve, Jonah was swallowed by the whale, and all the other stories that exist in the Bible. And that's why he finds it impossible to believe in evolution. So, after he testifies, he'll be interviewed on the steps of the courthouse, and in a very famous interview, he'll say, quote, "It is better to believe in the rock of ages than the age of rocks." The trial will end after I want to mention one other thing. 5 days after William Jennings Bryan testifies, he passes away from natural causes. So I guess it took too much out of the old boy, and that was his last gasp. And this is the last time we'll be talking about William Jennings Bryan in this class. So the trial ends, and obviously the verdict is guilty. The law is simple. It's illegal to teach evolution in Tennessee in a high school class. Scopes taught evolution. So he's found guilty. The fine is $100. His supporters all chip in and pay it for him. But I mean, this creates this national debate over this issue. And then Scopes will go on to teach biology in another state where it's not illegal. Another sort of oddball happening of the 1920s. So what we want to take a look at next is some other things socially that are going on during the 1920s. And one of those is the emergence of society becoming more modern and more like today with, and also the booming economy, which we'll be talking about later when we lead up to the Depression. But one thing that's going to change everything in America is the work of industrialist Henry Ford. Henry Ford's going to change everything, not just as far as automobiles go, as we'll talk about momentarily, but he's also going to change the way that factories operate, because he is the one who develops assembly line technology. Building things piece by piece, going down an assembly line is much more effective than building something separately. Namely, with automobiles, refrigerators, anything you can think of, building it on an assembly line is much more efficient and productive. And that's the technology that Henry Ford will bring to automobiles. Now, Henry Ford will transform society greatly with his automobile, and he will do so. Here, let me find the picture I'm looking for. When you really think about it, we've got a couple photographs and an advertisement for Ford Motor Cars on 707 in your book. The landmark automobile that Henry Ford will develop in his factories in Detroit, which quickly becomes the Motor City, is the Model T. Now, the Model T was extremely inexpensive automobile and very reliable. And to give you an idea of its rise to popularity, in 1914, there were about 500,000 Model Ts on the road in America. By 1930, Henry Ford had sold more than 20 million Model Ts to Americans. So this is what really made us an automobile-based society like we are today. The The Model T, as I mentioned before, was extremely inexpensive. Its average price during this time period, brand new, right off the car lot, was $260 for a brand new car. Now, obviously, times have changed, and in some cases, you'll pay more than that for one tire for a car. So the one other great thing about the Model T was they were very easy to repair, and each one came with its own simple toolkit and instruction booklet. Now, Henry Ford, when he was interviewed one time talking about the rise of the Model T, he talked about how the Model T being manufactured on the assembly lines made things so simple. And also he talked about how with the Model T, you had your choice. You could get a Model T in black, or black. That's also why the price was so inexpensive. They only made black Model Ts. They were all the same. You couldn't order the package with leather seats and the great stereo system and all that or whatever. When you bought a Model T, you got a Model T. And also, one day I was thinking about this when I saw a person walking around in a big parking lot. They had forgot where they parked their car, which happens to people from time to time. Can you imagine when there were 20 million black Model Ts on the road? How in the world did you find your car in a parking lot? Now, what this also leads to is the rise of Spinoff Industries, like the one on the top of page 707. You're going to have millions and millions of cars driving around America. You need gas stations. So they're going to be built throughout the country. Also, it's going to lead to massive construction of roads, paved roads. The old rutted wagon trails weren't going to do anymore because they'd rattle you and your car apart driving on them. So this led to massive building of roads, led to the whole gas station, oil industry in America, and it also transformed this assembly line technology into technology that's put into place in all factories. So, the next thing we want to talk about is airplanes. Now, we mentioned airplanes in passing with World War II and the fact that we barely had any in our Army Air Corps. Airplanes are going to really develop quickly in America. And obviously, the first famous flight in America that you've all studied before was when Orville and Wilbur Wright, out on Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, out on the Outer Banks in 1903, had their first sustained flight. From there, it's going to take off tremendously, excuse the pun, but what's really going to transform airplanes is World War I, because there's all sorts of research and development done on airplanes where they're changing almost on a monthly basis because all sides in the war believed if they produced the ultimate airplane, it would may be the turning point of the war and, like the secret weapon, quote unquote. So airplanes developed tremendously during World War I, and then the technology continues to be developed during the 1920s. Now, if you take a look on page 708 in your book, there's a famous photograph of Charles Lindbergh standing next to his very famous aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis. Lucky Lindy, as he was known, made his famous flight across the Atlantic in 1927 in that plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Now, this was a real accomplishment in aerospace, and to have a solo flight with one person flying that little plane all the way from Long Island to France. And It was a daring fight, and it's going to make Lucky Lindy one of the most popular people in the world. And I don't know if you've ever seen The Spirit of St. Louis. There's two. He had two of these made. One of them is down in the Smithsonian, and the other is in a aeronautics museum out in Nassau County, out on Long Island. I've been to both, and the Spirit of St. Louis is an amazing aircraft because when you look at it, even though you can't tell it when you from here, from this view of it, there's no front windshield. He flew this all the way across the Atlantic Ocean using a series of mirrors to steer this. The only windows were on the side. You can see one of them behind his elbow there. And the reason why is every available inch within that airplane, besides where he was seated, were fuel tanks because it needed that much fuel to get across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, very brave man. Remember, there's no such thing as radar or anything like that. So he flies this thing all the way across the Atlantic Ocean using a series of mirrors to navigate. So, no wonder he was so popular and famous. Now, we're going to save a major portion of this chapter. This is where we're going to call it quits before the quiz that I'm going to put up online tomorrow on the 17th. We're going to save the effects of Prohibition and its leading to gangsterism and so forth for when we pick up after the quiz. And that's what I'll start up with in lecture number 20, and we'll finish off chapter 30 then. So, class, I'll see you in a while. You guys will all do a good job on this quiz over the weekend, I'm sure. And remember, you also have to do the ACE practice tests from chapter 25 through 30. Many of you have been submitting them diligently. All those are due by the 19th also. Then we'll open up and start into our next section, and I'll start recording a whole new series of lectures. So that's it for today. I'll be talking to you soon. Work hard this weekend on your assignments. And once again, stay home and be safe, and we'll get through this thing. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Bye now.